Hello and welcome to this final session of the CA 2021 conference. It has been really wonderful over the past few days to see a plan come together, and the whole conference for me has been such an amazing advert for the bright vibrancy of the classics community, both in the UK and beyond. I'm going to say a few very heartfelt thank yous at the end, so please stay tuned for that. I'm also going to say well done to making it for the end. For anybody who's attended all 6 sessions as well, I think you deserve an extra gypsy cream during the discussions today. And thanks too for all of the interaction in the chat, in the Q&As and on social media. We felt a real sense of a community out there participating in this conference, which has been fantastic. So yes, the bar has been set pretty high over the last few days, but we also have something pretty special in store for you in this final session, which is entitled Classics in the Marketplace, Being a Classicist in Public, where we have yet another fantastic lineup for you. Rather than introduce the panelists myself, however, and steal anyone's thunder, I'm going to hand you over to Liz Gloyn, reader in Latin language and literature at Royal Holloway, and whom I have had the pleasure of working with until very recently as a CA council member. Okay, over to you, Liz.
Hello, hi everybody. It's wonderful to be closing out this CA session. This panel, as some of you may remember, was originally scheduled to be delivered at the 2020 CA at Swansea. So it's really lovely to be able to bring it to life here with our original shining star cast of shining stars as planned on this venue. So thank you very much to the CA Council for inviting us back. We are going to be taking a slightly different format to the traditional panel format today. Myself and my 3 co-panelists are going to talk briefly for sort of 10 minutes or so about our journey as classicists in public in the marketplace, the choices we've made about engaging beyond the academy, why we've made those choices, what's worked, what hasn't worked, what's changed in our own personal journeys. And then after about 10 minutes from each of us, we will open up to Q&A and discussion. Hopefully you'll be able to see on the right hand side of your screen that there is a question and answer forum. So if you have questions that come up, please pop them in there, and when questions come up, you as audience members will be able to vote them up or down, making us feel surprisingly as if we're on Reddit. How trendy. And then there's also obviously the discussion forum, which I gather has been very lively in other sessions for sort of broad conversation, and we do want to have your conversation as part of this session, because the way we originally envisaged it was as an opportunity to ask questions, to have a discussion, to talk around this issue about what it actually means to be doing what we do in public, which is something that so many of us do and are expected to do without necessarily a lot of support, a lot of backup, and a lot of training. So this is sort of our experience and the lessons that we've learned as far as we're concerned, and we hope that that is helpful and useful, and we are really looking forward to where the conversation goes after we've all spoken about our own particular journeys. So to introduce my co-panelists, first of all, we have Dr. May Musié. She is currently Public Engagement Manager at the Bodleian Libraries in Oxford. She's also worked as a Knowledge Exchange Officer at Oxford and as the Outreach Officer for the Oxford Classics Faculty, and her PhD at Swansea focused on race and ethnicity in the ancient Greek novels. So May is coming from a background of working institutionally as a classicist rather than sort of from an academic post, and brings a particular perspective on the kinds of opportunities that brings. We also have with us Dr. Jane Draycott, a lecturer at the University of Glasgow. Her research specialises in prostheses and assistive technology, and she's recently published on Roman domestic medical practice. And Jane is also interested in classical reception, particularly in video game kind of formats, and sort of that kind of working out of the classical world in the post-classical environment in which we find ourselves. And my final co-panelist is Professor Neville Morley. who is Professor in Classics and Ancient History at Exeter, and his research focuses around the ancient economic and social history and classical reception, especially around Thucydides, where he's done some really interesting outreach work and sort of impact work there. I'm going to be quiet now, and I'm going to hand over to May, and then we'll work through our 4 panelists, and then, as I say, we'll come back to questions and discussions. So over to you, May.
Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you very much, James. You know, it's such a pleasure to be here, even remotely, and I'm really, really glad that my alma mater, Swansea, is able to, you know, sort of reorganise this for next year, hopefully too. So fingers crossed we'll see each other physically. So in the next 10 minutes, I think I'm just going to briefly talk about how, you know, sort of my encounters with particularly one form of social media, which is Twitter. So if you just sort of bear with me whilst I share my screen with you. Yeah. Can you all see that at all?
I think we're still getting the PowerPoint view rather than the presenter view, May.
I see. Okay, so just bear with me for a second. It worked in the it worked. Oh dear. Well, there's a tech hitch.
Try hitting resume slideshow, May. Can you see on the main slide?
So, wow, this is terrible. Not a great start, is it? I can't quite escape from it. Let's see what we could do here. So you're unable to see any slides at the moment?
We can see the open PowerPoint, but we can't see the actual slideshow.
Okay, let's. Oh, okay. Is that? Can you see it now?
No, I think let's just run with the slides as they are, May. I think we'll live with that rather than try and fix it too much, because as I say, we can see the PowerPoint document.
Excellent, thank you. So as Liz said, I came to Classics from sort of Swansea, and then I ended up in Oxford to do public engagement and outreach. And so my first kind of foray really was into on social media, was running the Oxford Classics Twitter account, and this is what I'll be talking about in today's very quick presentation, starting off with my own experiences, and then hopefully we'll open up the discussion for other people's experiences. So as I said, my kind of background to where it all kind of started was to take on the outreach classics account for Oxford, and that was quite interesting in itself. You know, it's sort of early on. I didn't really know very much about social media, and even then, you know, sort of the university itself was building a sort of a social media strategy, and so it was just really just sort of starting off. I inherited the account from Dr. Cressida Dick, who was my Ryan, not Cressida Dick, Ryan, who was my predecessor. And so, you know, from beginning, I think the classics department wanted to kind of reach out to a variety of different audiences, and I took on the social media account and grew it in, you know, not just within the Twitter sphere, but also on Facebook and various other platforms. Just as I, you know, sort of was halfway through my kind of stint at the classics department, one of the sort of teachers that I interacted with said, why don't you actually put your photo on the account rather than this kind of faceless Faculty of Classics logo? And she thought it was really important for me to do that, to try and break down the sort of misconception and barriers to you know, sort of classics, particularly those from a non-traditional background. So I think that was my kind of first foray into sort of having my own kind of identity stamped in the kind of public sphere. So that was the start. And then when I left the classics faculty, I moved on to another job within the university. A friend, a few sort of academic friends said, you know, I think you should have your personal account. By this point, I've managed to get over my fear of Twitter, and I started sort of building my own account. So this is what it currently kind of looks like. I try and put myself, a lot of myself into it, but there is that sort of fine balance between the sort of professional and personal. And as you can see, there's the sort of, you know, the Bodleian Libraries and University of Oxford is there, but also the fact that I'm a trustee of Classics for All, and you know, the sort of co-founded the Classics and Community Project with Arlene and Steve. Those things are really, really important to me. And at the top, I'm talking about the kind of visual nature of the profile right now. You will notice there's a sort of Ethiopic manuscript there, which is called the Harp of Mary. Again, that's the sort of really strong influence for me in terms of projecting my sort of heritage and cultural identity. So when you see that, you're pretty much getting a lot of me already. Now, what I'm going to go through is really the sort of good, the bad, and the kind of ugly of social media, and then my own interactions with it. And I suppose the most recent best experience I've had is talking classics and Herodotus with MC Hammer and Dan Hicks, which you know, I would never ever have thought possible. And so, you know, it's very much a new experience for me, interacting with perhaps people who may not be directly linked to classics but have such a high platform. I became involved with this sort of online conversations talking about decolonization and repatriation through my kind of interest on Ethiopian and Eritrean manuscripts, but also through my interactions with Dan Hicks, who's the professor of archaeology at Oxford, and his recent book is on the Benin bronzes, and he, you know, sort of includes me in these discussions. And next thing you know, we are on a platform called Clubhouse, which reaches out to a lot of African American and Africans about academic topics. So, you know, this is sort of a platform that is, you know, I never thought would be possible. And one of the things that I think about social media is that it's very spontaneous and very much, you know, sort of moving very, very, very quickly. And so, you know, the kind of things I'm kind of interested in is, in a way, all kind of mixed in with the personal and the professional. So for me, it's very hard to sort of separate what is classics, what is heritage, what is decolonization, and what is public engagement, because it all kind of merges into one. And I suppose the kind of positive highlights for me is, you know, I've managed to kind of promote my own work, but of others, and the work that I do in terms of public engagement to a much wider audiences. I've been fortunate enough to have, you know, sort of interactions with the Ethiopian embassy during my public engagement work at the Bodleian Libraries. I've been contacted by a few sort of TV producers and so forth to promote classics and public engagement. And it's also really nice to, as you see one of the comments there, to link with students from the past who went to Swansea and studied classics and so forth. And so that's really, really important to me. Now to discuss the slides. Yes?
Sorry, we're not seeing the slides move on the page, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we've got the view that we've got here is the PowerPoint window with CA Classics CA 2021 at the top.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you could go back to that view. There we are. Yeah, lovely. So if you can move us through there. Sorry about that.
That's all right. It's absolutely my fault. So quickly go through the... Is that right?
That seems to be right. Yes, try moving forward.
Yep, I'm going to whiz through because I've kind of talked about all of this. there's a few topics there. Excellent. And what sort of briefly talked about the Oxford Classics sort of page, my own profile, and my interactions with sort of people outside the classic sphere. The sort of I'm just showing the good highlights at the moment, sort of interacting with sort of TV sort of producers and writers, and those who organize cultural affairs, shall we say, who find you on Twitter and sort of engage with you in that way. And then the sort of the bad. So this is just a kind of recent interaction. There are many of these examples where you get accused of being a feminist, communist, race, whatever, when you try and interact with people on, say, the very sort of topical conversations around race and classics. And this is an example where a person got really hecked up about the program Black Achilles, and then as you could see, there's Tim and me trying to sort of talk to him on a level, but him not wanting to engage, and obviously not respecting Western civilization, and being from a feminist, communist background, etc. He didn't want to listen to what we had to say, and then sometimes you get a very kind of personal attack on your identity, and sort of my identity as a former refugee, and sort of been here and sort of moving around the different spheres of identity, gets exposed on Twitter. And I've made a conscious decision to talk about that, but then I suppose I'm now kind of prepared that I'll get a negative pushback on that. So yeah, but then it's a fantastic way to promote your work. So you have to kind of balance the good, the bad, and the ugly with the sort of, okay, overall, what is the experiences? And it's for me, I think I've had the brilliant opportunity to promote not just my own work, but also of the people that I work with. And the opportunities I had to kind of move from not just classics, but the sort of contribute to the decolonization debate, contribute to the repatriation debate, and through different mediums, and to invite speakers to the university to engage in these various topics. And I think I'm pretty lucky to have the sort of space like the University of Oxford to try and promote that. Now, the tips that I could probably say in terms of keeping you sane on social media is to try and build a kind of community, an online community. Now, I've joined the kind of medieval Twitter, for example, for interdisciplinary sort of opportunities and multidisciplinary opportunities, and they've been, I've been learning through that for myself, but also to have offline conversations when you do have those really negative comments about your race, about your gender, about all these things, that you have a really great number of people around you to support you through that. And I guess it's to develop a really hard skin, because you are kind of putting yourself out there, and I do tend to put quite a bit of myself onto the social media platform, but not as much as I would say on Facebook. I keep that extremely personal for that. Yes, and so that's really very much sort of a whirlwind tour of my own experiences on Twitter, but sort of happy to pick up on any of the points that I've raised in our discussions.
Thanks ever so much, May. Okay, so we're going to, obviously, if you've got questions for May or ideas or thoughts coming out of this, please do pop them into the Q&A, pop them into the discussion forum. But as you're sort of mulling on that, I'm going to pass over to Jane. Jane, go ahead, please.
Hello, everyone. I am just going to share my screen because I have some slides. So you should be seeing a cup of coffee appearing very shortly. Can you see? Yeah, excellent. Okay. So as Liz said, I'm Dr. Jane Draycott. I'm a lecturer in ancient history at the University of Glasgow. And just a bit of a disclaimer at the outset of my presentation, since we originally conceived this panel in I think either late 2019 or early 2020, my social media usage has actually changed quite a bit, but that's something that if anyone is interested in, you can ask me a question later, we can talk about that later. So I currently use 3 social media platforms: Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. This has happened organically with no real attempt at strategizing or coordinating on my part. I just picked them up because I fancied them for various reasons at various points. I attempt to keep the 3 and their contents fairly distinct, but there is inevitable overlap because, for example, my Instagram feeds into my Twitter. I promote my YouTube channel on my Twitter. And yes, I mean, with my Twitter account, that is mainly, I mainly use Twitter for my own personal Twitter account, but I do also have extra Twitter accounts for projects, and I've put them on the slide there. And I will say, actually, from time to time, people find me on social media and they confuse me with another Jane Draycott. So there is a Jane Draycott who I think may also be a doctor. She's a poet and she works at, I think, the University of Lancaster. And so periodically I do get contacted on Twitter by people who want to tell me how much they admire my poetry. And I sort of have to tell them quite nicely, because I don't think the other Jane Draycott is on social media, but that's not me. So yes, that's also something, I suppose, that's a social media issue. How do you identify yourself or differentiate yourself from someone else with a similar name? Again, we can come back to that. I'm also findable through my University of Glasgow staff page. This is reasonably up to date and detailed about my academic research, although I can't currently update it from home. So as much as I would like to keep it even more updated, I can't get into it from my home computer. And I also have an academia.edu page. That's not up to date. I used to upload copies of all my academic work to it, but I no longer do that due to widely publicised concerns about the site and the commercialisation of people's labour. I just haven't got around to deleting my profile completely, but it is sort of handy to have it in a list of my publications there. And if people want my publications and they contact me and ask me about them, I'm perfectly happy to send them, PDFs and off prints and things like that. Something else I think that often happens on social media between academics. So just to go into the individual platforms in a little bit more detail. So Twitter, my Twitter account is predominantly professional. I would like to keep it 100% professional, but I think that's virtually impossible, really, these days. I've been on Twitter for about 8 years. Last time I checked, which was last week when I was putting this together, I have 2,649 followers, which seems like a lot. But then I checked Liz and May and Neville's, and they've all got more than me, like lots more. So it seems like a lot to me. But yes, I mean it's certainly not as many as you might find on the blue tick account. And I looked at my analytics, and interestingly, the most viewed tweet for the last month was when I tweeted about the new trailer for the epic TV series Domina, and lots of people actually engaged with that and watched the trailer as well. So sometimes my tweets seem to have quite a far reach, get seen and liked and engaged with by lots of people. Other times they don't, and I can never really anticipate what is going to happen when I tweet something. And as I said before, I have 2 other Twitter accounts, one for a now finished AHRC project, Cosmetics Unwrap, and one for the University of Glasgow's Games and Gaming Lab. And both of those I run or ran with other people, which share the load a little bit. My Instagram, this is at the moment personal, really. I've been on Instagram for about 2 years. I have 315 followers. And again, that seems like a nice amount to me. Although granted, compared to, you know, some other people, it is nothing at all. The most popular post I have had over the last 2 years is about getting my hair cut. So there you go. I mean, this is my the sort of the personal stuff that people like on my Instagram versus the professional stuff that they like on my Twitter. And I also have a YouTube channel, and this is professional. I started this in the autumn of 2018, and I started this to do book reviews of books that I read that were relevant in some way to classics or ancient history or archaeology. And I must admit, I started with great intentions, and I haven't actually uploaded any new videos for about a year because, well, the pandemic happened. And on the one hand, you'd think that I'd have lots of time, both for reading and making videos. And I suppose in some respects, I did have lots of time. But at the same time, I was rather exhausted from a full-time job in a pandemic. So I haven't really done with this what I hoped I would do. 64 subscribers so far, not surprising because, as I said, I haven't uploaded it in a year, but that still impressed me to think that I could go from nothing to sort of 64 with no effort on my part really, except the videos that are already there. The most watched video review by far is of Not All Dead White Men by Donna Zuckerberg. And I suppose I guess I would say I'm not really surprised at that, actually. And based on the comments that the video got, which were about the entire premise of the book, really, rather than anything to do with my review, I get the sense that it wasn't necessarily that people were looking for me or looking for my videos, but they were looking for that particular book, and they had things they wanted to say about it. So what can I say about the positive sides of being on social media? Well, I think first and foremost, the ability to stay connected to the wider world. I mean, particularly over the last year. I mean, I have been working from home for over a year now. I have seen the number of people I have seen in real life, except for my partner, two friends who happen to have either lived in Glasgow or been visiting in Glasgow. And one of them was a professional colleague. Everybody else I have seen on Zoom or interacted with via social media. So it's been good for that. There's also the ability to share personal news, personal/professional news. And that can be both planned, you know, I have a book coming out, I have an article coming out, I'm going to be doing a talk at a conference, etc., etc. Or spur of the moment, you know, oh, I got a grant, or I got a job, or, you know, stuff like that. I mean, we've all seen it. And that's good because it means that, you know, you can sort of announce things publicly and people can hear about them. And it can save you quite a lot of individual text messages or phone calls or whatever else. You can keep up to date with friends that you have around the country, if not the world. And because the lot of a sort of a fairly transient early career academic is one of moving around wherever there's a job. So you do make lots of friends, but they are all over the country, all over the world. They're not necessarily where you live locally. There's also the ability to share ancient news. Something that I do most days is I look for news stories related primarily to ancient Rome, Roman history, Roman archaeology, but also the classical world more broadly. Classical reception, you know, novels, TV shows, films, games, and I tweet about them, and people seem to quite like that. Those tend to get retweeted and engaged with. I think, I suppose, people appreciate that someone else is doing the searching for them, and then they can just, you know, read the articles that get thrown up. There is keeping up to date with the discipline, because depending on where you happen to live or work, you are not necessarily plugged into a lot of institutions or a lot of people in the institution. Before I lived and worked in Glasgow, I lived and worked in Lampeter, and that was fairly cut off from London, from Oxford, from Cambridge, from most of the country, in fact. So social media was a way of finding out what was going on in the discipline around the country and around the world. And it means that you get invitations for things that you wouldn't otherwise have got. So of course there are negatives. I think first and foremost, there is just the negativity that comes with spending a lot of time online and exposing yourself to all sorts of things, both in relation to the wider world. I mean, in the last few years, we have had Brexit, we have had the pandemic, but also the discipline and the negative things that happen in the discipline and keep happening in the discipline, despite lots of discussion of those things. At least in the sphere of social media, but the same issues come up again and again. There doesn't seem to be much progress, or people who are trying to make progress continually get stymied. And there is the fact that social media can be quite addictive. It can be, if you have settings on your phone or whatever else that notify you that you have got posts. If you've posted something and you want responses but you don't get them, you can find yourself checking quite a lot to see what is happening. And I have had to exercise quite a bit of self-control at times to try and minimize my social media use. And during the pandemic, actually, that's one of the things I have been trying to do is not get caught up with doom scrolling, as the phrase has been coined. Now, I'll speak here about something that May mentioned towards the end of her presentation. My experience is that, to date at least, I haven't suffered from any of the well-documented horrible experiences that women on social media are often subjected to. So I haven't had pile-ons in response to something I've tweeted. I haven't been trolled. I haven't been doxxed. I haven't been sent unsavory, unsolicited images. I'm sure you can imagine what I'm referring to, although I have had the occasional, chancer slide into my DMs and want to, talk to me. I've had the occasional unwelcome comment, but I just tend to ignore them. And if I had to venture an opinion as to why I have been, well, I hesitate to use the word lucky, because of course we should all be able to use social media without any of that stuff. But I think it's probably because I don't invite it, either in my sheer personage, presence, or in my behaviour. And I do not mean to sound like I am victim blaming at all when I sort of say this. I can't really think of another way to say it, but I don't appear to be considered provocative or controversial. And I'm aware, and I'll sort of refer back to May here, I have white privilege, for example. So I don't have my face on my social media, on my Twitter account, so people can't really get a sense of me in that respect. So because I'm not considered to be provocative or controversial, I don't inspire the kind of animosity in the section of online commenters who liked to be outraged about feminism, about socialism, about decolonization, about classism, anything like that. My online activism, for want of a better word, it takes the form of being supportive of others currently. There are other people who are better equipped to undertake that sort of thing than me. I am trying to be an ally. I am trying to learn and educate myself. I do not want to take up space that other people are better suited to. So future plans, because I think it's important to bear in mind that, social media is constantly changing, the landscape is constantly changing, and certainly my social media use has changed over time. Over the last year, it's changed quite a bit. As I said at the outset, I haven't really strategized or coordinated my social media presence, But I'm starting to think that I probably should, especially since my Twitter feed is displayed on my University of Glasgow staff page, and I frequently have to remind myself, should I really say that when it's going onto the university website, and there could be some pushback. Hasn't happened yet, but it's something to bear in mind. My Twitter account is public, so anyone can see what I tweet. I have thought about setting up some sort of personal website and or blog, and then running everything through that. I mean, the other thing to bear in mind is how much time it takes to have an effective online presence, and there are ways of being efficient, I think, or more efficient, so that you don't end up spending so much time on it. I would like to develop my YouTube channel, start making videos again, because I do read a lot of relevant classics books, and I would like to talk to people about them. But again, that is just something I have to try and find the time to do, and have to think about if that is a worthwhile use of my time. And yeah, there is a question mark at the end of that future plans deliberately. Who knows? I mean, I'm very inspired by the people who are on this panel with me, and other people as well who have started using TikTok and things like that for communicating classics research. So who knows? To conclude then, in my experience, somewhat counterintuitively, appearing on TV, radio and podcasts doesn't seem to have boosted my social media profile at all, I don't think. So, if I were deliberately trying to cultivate a higher social media profile, well, nothing I've done to date seems to have achieved that ambition for me. Being relatively well known on one social media platform doesn't seem to automatically guarantee that you'll become well known on another. Just because people follow me on Twitter doesn't mean they're going to follow me on Instagram, and it certainly doesn't mean they're going to watch my YouTube videos. If I try and be cynical about it, or calculated, or whatever else you might want to call it, I actually don't seem to be able to predict what people will respond positively to. So ultimately, I simply please myself, and potentially that is something to think about if you are considering having some kind of social media presence. It's yours, and you're the one who's running it, and if it pleases you, then perhaps that's enough. Okay, thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Jane. I think that's really important, that you are the person doing it, and you have to do it because you want to, not because anybody else is telling you to. So I'm going to hand over now to Neville. Neville.
Thank you. Liz very kindly didn't introduce me as the token old person who is nevertheless on these platforms. I'm not the oldest classicist to be active on social media. If you don't already follow her on Twitter, I would strongly recommend Avril Cameron for a start. But I do go back with this quite a long way. Certainly, I first joined Facebook pretty well when it first became accessible to people in universities in the UK. And actually, very, very early on in that experience, I learnt some important lessons, because at the beginning, I think no one had any real idea what this was all about. And you receive a friend request and it feels almost rude to turn it down. And there is a sort of, I think it's now a slightly more developed etiquette of what do you do if someone follows you on Twitter, or, is there a sort of a degree of obligation to follow some people and not others, and how do you respond, and sort of so forth. Though I think it's still very, very fuzzy. But certainly then the sort of, X wants to be your friend is a slightly difficult thing to turn down. And I received friend requests from current students, which seemed fine. And then just a week or so later, what popped up in my feed as a post from one of these quotes friends was a pornographic video, the contents of which still make me blush to think about. At which point I resolved that, okay, one thing I do not do is be friends with current students on Facebook. I mean, this was a long time ago. I think probably we've settled into a sort of a practice where I think May referred to this. Facebook is primarily private, and generally speaking, we are, quotes, friends with people there with whom we do have sort of some kind of existing relationship. And I think we've learnt to have most of our privacy settings much stricter. But I think some of the lessons I learnt from that particular experience apply to social media more generally. One is to say, don't trust the platform, or at least the platform has got its own agenda and it is working to manipulate you. I do think, and whatever it is, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., there are reasons why this is made available to you without charge, and the answer is because in a lot of ways you are the product, and it is designed to be addictive, it's designed to draw you in, it's designed to get you to spend lots and lots of time there, and equally you are helping to keep other people spending lots of time there. So, okay, Facebook's language of friends is, I think, particularly coercive, but there are different aspects of any of these platforms where I think you just have to be slightly suspicious. More importantly, I would say, in terms of, what do we do on these platforms? Firstly, it's the need to remember who might be seeing what you post. And the risk of thinking, well, I'm in a conversation with a friend, that's fine, I chat to them, whether, again, this can be on Twitter rather than on Facebook. Well, actually, anything you say can be picked up, can be, in many cases, retweeted. It can be found years later and potentially used against you. I remember, again, this is quite a long time ago, there was a sort of former student of mine who'd gone off to do a PhD who tweeted very, very interesting things about their studies and about, sort of what they were reading and so forth, but also had a tendency to be sitting in a seminar doing almost a stream of consciousness sort of, God, this is crap, I can't believe how boring this person is. And, it wasn't that they were followed by a lot of people, but they were followed by some. It could easily be picked up, and you could very, very quickly establish who it was that they were talking about. And I suppose I would say, that's a really bad idea. It's a really bad idea if you don't realize what you're doing. So, if you're on social media, I would say one basic rule is, well, don't drunk tweet is probably too much to hope from any of us, but, try to keep some degree of filter when you're drunk tweeting. Keep in mind, who is your potential audience. And I suppose on top of that, keep in mind that there is no context. So what you say, which will be perfectly clear to you and your friends and possibly to other members of the classical profession, might not actually be obvious to somebody else, or indeed they might well have their own agenda and interpret it according to that. Both of those things, I suppose it's a kind of, defensive mechanism. And the third one, which particularly Jane referred to, the question of deciding how much you want to share of personal stuff. I mean, all online sort of personae are artificially constructed personae. It's a matter of deciding how far do you share personal things, how far do you sort of occasionally mention them, do you exclude that completely? And I suppose more broadly, it's, again, what both May and Jane referred to, it's simply having a good idea of why are you actually doing this? Because this is a time investment. I'm not sure about kind of the metaphor of classics in the marketplace, but social media is a marketplace where the currency is time and attention. And you do have to think, well, how much do I invest in this activity? What am I actually getting out of it? there is an enormous amount you can get out of it. And I just sort of, reiterate what Jane and May both said. It is an opportunity to present your ideas and your work, possibly to get attention from people, possibly just for the sheer pleasure of sharing them. I think being a Twitter account that just says, look at me, I'm about to appear on a television series, kind of doesn't work. There are, professional accounts where clearly someone has been told by their publisher, go on Twitter and publicize. The successful accounts, I would say, kind of do offer more than that. They sort of, you have to give people a reason to bother paying attention. But potentially, it is a means of reaching a wider audience. Twitter, of course, there's a limit to what you can say to that wider audience, given the character limits, and given, you can do threaded tweets, but it's actually quite difficult to get them to work properly and make sense. I do lament the fact that blogging appears to be in a steady rate of decline, but I maintain a blog simply because it allows me to explore ideas in a lot more depth, but still in a relatively informal, experimental way. It's a sort of much more flexible format than writing for a normal academic journal. I can play with ideas, I can play with things that, say, would run to a couple of paragraphs rather than a full article. I can explore things which I would never in a million years attempt to publish as serious academic work, but I can also do sort of dry runs of ideas, engage with other people's ideas, book reviews, all of that sort of thing. So I lament the fact that certainly my viewing figures have declined steadily over the last 4 years, and blogs do appear to be rather passé, but there are things that they do really well. YouTube and podcasts, higher demands for kind of the technical knowledge to get them to work and look decent, I suppose I would say. But again, I've done a few. I think I find them, less easy and comfortable than writing, but it's because, I've learned how to write, I've learned how to lecture, I haven't really learned how to do the sort of, different kinds of more intimate video things. And I imagine there may be ways of using TikTok, but heaven only knows, I am too old for TikTok. All of that is, in a sense, the broadcast side of things. But actually, I think being involved in social media in the broadest sense is actually about much more. Firstly, it's about listening in a broad metaphorical sense. It's about sort of drawing in information. One of my major uses of Twitter, particularly, is as a means of sort of keeping up with what is happening in multiple disciplines, where quite simply, they connect to my work. I'm interested in knowing what's going on. I don't have time to read everything involved. Whereas sort of choosing the right people to follow means that on the whole, I end up having a sense of, okay, what is the current, big debate in, I don't know, history of political thought or something like that. So sort of selecting the people who are going to tell you interesting things about things you're interested in can be enormously valuable. Certainly a way of keeping up what is happening in classics and ancient history across the globe is vastly easier than it ever was. That can be really, really valuable. It can all get a bit overwhelming. I'm going to try, I don't know if everyone is familiar with TweetDeck, but if you're not, but are interested in Twitter, I would very, very strongly recommend this, because actually what it means is you can follow thousands of people, but you can make it very easy to get the sort of the tweets from the people you are most interested in. Attempts to share screen. I have no idea if this is working properly yet, but Okay, yes, it seems to be. So just a shot of a bit of my tweet deck, where quite simply I've got different lists. I've got a list for classicists. I've got a list for sort of political stuff. I've got a list for people I regard as essential. I've got an automatic search for references to Thucydides and various other things like that. So that just helps keep things organized. And that, I think, really makes a difference. I think that's about everything. Oh no, final one. Yeah, networking. So in a sense, the sort of, you know, both broadcasting and receiving, it is the opportunity to get involved in discussions and debates. It's the opportunity to make contact with people. You know, as Jane says, I mean, a lot of my contact with people over the last year or so, it's not just that it's been online. In a number of cases, it's with people whom I've never actually met in person, but social media is enough of a basis, in fact, to have developed genuine relationships. All sorts of, I suppose, you know, cautions about how to use this. Again, I tick all of the privilege boxes, so I get very, very little pushback from people. I get more pushback for my sort of subsidiary email account, which corrects misattributed quotations of Thucydides. And gently says, no, that was not Thucydides, that was 19th century soldier and author, Sir William F. Butler. And that does annoy some people immoderately, much more than me as me, which I possibly tells you something about, you know, the power of sort of academic authority. But I think that's probably enough, if, you know, and pass on to Liz.
Thank you, Neville. Right, so now it's me. So I am going to talk a bit more about sort of how I've sort of came to being a classicist in public, as it were, and where I've come to and how things have changed. So I first got involved with this kind of thing when I was finishing off my PhD in the US. I'd done my undergraduate, my master's in the UK, went to the US for the PhD, had quite a good network of people in the US, knew nobody in the UK. And I wanted to start to build UK connections. I was very strategic, I'm afraid, painfully so. Now I look back on it. I got library books out. You can tell you're an academic when you get the library books out. And I thought, you know, do I want to blog? Do I want to Twitter? What's the best way of doing this? And I decided Twitter was where I was going to go first, because the things I wanted to share were Twitter-sized thoughts. This was back in the day of smaller character limits. But what I didn't have those kinds of bigger, broader ideas that I wanted to share. It was little snippets of stuff I was coming across in the PhD research and just wanted to put out there for people to go, ooh, that's interesting. And I did that, and I linked into a whole group who are still about, the hashtag PhD chat community, who were fantastic for support and solidarity for working through the PhD process. And as that sort of evolved and developed, I found that actually I did have things I wanted to say on a blog. So I started a blog, and that was initially to sort of share thoughts about the research, thoughts about the PhD experience. When I came back to the UK and started a job, it became about the teaching and about the transition back. And those two platforms have ebbed and flowed for me over time, I think. The blog, as Neville says, sadly, blogs appear to be less and less popular than they were. If I look at the stats for mine, it was most popular the year after I started it, and then it's been a slow decline ever since. But I've changed what that blog is for in some really interesting ways. The most recent activity on it is a really grumpy poem about being in lockdown and having a 5-year-old at home during January. But before that, the thing I've mainly been using it for is for posts to support teachers teaching the OCR classical civilization syllabus, working on the love and relationships module, which features Seneca on love and relationships, which just happens to be what my PhD is on. I am the national expert. Worrying thing to find yourself saying. And so rather than say everybody, oh yes, there is a reasonably priced book from Cambridge University Press, and it's very reasonably priced for you to get one chapter from, instead I did a series of blog posts for teachers to be able to access and share with their pupils. And that has been and that obviously was a project that I ended up talking with teachers on Twitter about. Here is a need, tell me what you want, tell me how to do this. And so that kind of public profile that by that point I'd built up came together with having the blog, and that's sort of become much more of a resource place. Also at the time when I was starting the blog, I wanted to have a public profile I was in control of rather than the university, which is still a useful thing for people who, again, as Jane says, with the transient nature of early career, you know, to have a profile that you're completely always in charge of is really important. And as I say, the blog has ebbed and flowed. I currently want to sit down and really write about teaching online in the pandemic for the last year and just get the ideas in one place, because I've always used the blog for talking about my teaching as well as my research. But that sort of ebb and flow, I think, is natural. And as Neville says, blogs may not be as popular as they once were, but they are still an important way for doing that longer form thought that doesn't necessarily belong in the journal article, that doesn't have enough weight for it, but you do actually just want to put it in one place and gather it together and shape it into a thing. I had been invited onto Facebook when I was in the States by students at the time who were terribly keen. I didn't join until after they'd left my course, which I was able to do at a US institution. But I've always sort of felt that Facebook wasn't the place to be making those kinds of professional connections, precisely because, as Neville says, of that friend language, and you can't sort of randomly go around friending senior academics in the UK, because that would be weird, because they were not my friends. I was a PhD student, and that's not how it worked. Whereas, of course, on Twitter, there was no problem with me sort of bumbling along and sort of running into people and having conversations and eventually following them, and they would follow me, and then you'd have a chat. And Neville says you can build up sort of nodding acquaintances and more in that kind of way. And that for me, because the point of becoming public, as it were, was about networking, was about making that jump back to the UK and knowing people, that was always really important for me in terms of always thinking about this as being public facing. I've made some slightly different choices about how much of me I share online, in that I have tried to be who I am. I think people who follow me on Twitter will know that I am quite open in some respects, but in other respects, I'm very, very refrained. I mean, people who follow me will know I have a small child, but they won't know very much about that small child. You know, that there is a level of maintaining his privacy that I'm quite committed to. For fairly obvious reasons, not least because we're starting to get children whose parents were not terribly committed to their privacy, sort of finding that photographs of them potty training are turning up in job search interviews. And we'd like not to do that if we possibly can avoid it. But those kinds of choices about how much of yourself you share, I mean, to me, it is to some extent, it's a question about integrity. It's about being honest about who you are, but there's also a boundary where you can say, well, I'm honest about these bits, but these bits I'm sort of putting over here, and those are not yours. Not everybody has a right to them. And that's also quite important, because when there are big conversations, big challenges going on, you do have to sometimes decide that just because you are on a public platform, not everybody has a right to all of you. As May has said, she has made deliberate decisions about participating in conversations around race, around discrimination, in advocating. However, there are still places where somebody doesn't get to own you. People don't get to live rent-free in your head. They don't get complete access to all your experiences. So those people who are sharing of themselves in a public forum should also be thinking about where their lines are. And it doesn't take, I think, in some interesting ways, it doesn't take much to make yourself accessible and lively as a human account. You're not sacrificing huge amounts of things by doing that, but thinking about where you feel your lines are and where you're comfortable with. One of the things I did certainly a lot a couple of years ago on Twitter, haven't done for a while, is I used to live tweet films, which on the one hand is a very personal activity because you're sharing very personal responses to a film. But on the other hand, you're also not really letting anybody sort of, you know, it's a very artificial feeling of sort of sitting next to somebody on the sofa, but really not letting them into your house. I'm articulating this badly, but hopefully you're getting the idea. in terms of engagement on the public side as well, beyond the social media platforms, that has upped, and that was a very deliberate choice when I published Tracking Classical Monsters in Popular Culture, which I wanted to get outside an academic audience. And that was when I started getting really involved in podcasts. As Neville said, there is a lot of energy and time that goes into setting one of these up. There's a lot of technique and sort of getting to grips with it. And Jane has spoken a little bit about the challenges of doing that on a YouTube kind of mode. I'm completely honest, I don't have time for learning all of those skills. And again, being honest with yourself about what's involved is really important. However, there are lots of other people who do it, who are very happy to have me come on and witter at them about monsters, about Roman Stoicism. And that has been sort of a really nice experience over the last 2 years, actually, because obviously podcasts don't stop being recorded in the pandemic, which I'm sure as a lot of you have been following. So that has been a really interesting avenue to certainly getting into networks that people who wouldn't otherwise know about my work. I think there are sort of three big things that stick with me. One is about time consuming. Pick what you can do. You don't have to do everything. Do what suits you. If you try something and it doesn't work, that's fine. Twitter happens to suit me a lot. It doesn't suit other people. That's fine. There's no judgment in it. Some people put an awful lot of effort into building up the connections and doing the work that involves more media presence and sort of more work with newspapers and pitching and that kind of stuff. Right now, I haven't got the time for that. And I'm unlikely to have the time for that for the foreseeable future. And that's okay. And sometimes when you see lots of people doing these kinds of things and having this kind of profile, it can sort of feel a bit, well, I get that. And actually, because you're prioritizing other things. So making the conscious decision about where those priorities are is important. The second thing, I think, as Neville has already mentioned and other people have mentioned, is about a multiplicity of voices. It becomes a lot easier to hear from people you might not otherwise hear from disciplines, from perspectives, to just sort of learn and really hear those things that sort of filter into you and help you think about things with your research, with your work, with your teaching, and to widen that perspective. And on the question of pushback, which other people have had, I think there is some place in sort of accepting that there are battles to fight and there are battles not to fight. As Jane said, when people decide they're going to be obnoxious, not every single person. There's a wonderful cartoon from which features somebody. I forgot which cartoon it is now. It's awful. Featuring somebody saying, "Somebody is wrong on the internet, and I must correct them." We all sit there with somebody wrong on the internet and correcting them. We will never get anything done. Sometimes we just have to allow somebody to be wrong on the internet. Indeed, it may be us who's wrong on the internet. Who knows? But it's about just sort of accepting that with some of these conversations, especially that people feel very invested in for reasons that are sometimes quite difficult to unpick, accepting that you're not going to be able to solve it all is sometimes important, and just allowing that really one objectionable tweet is going to pass. Again, I also experience great white privilege. I don't get a lot. I'm not quite sure why I don't get pushback. I would have thought that as somebody who sort of had a major role in founding the Women's Classical Committee, that would have sort of put the feminist sort of banner very firmly on, but apparently that doesn't count. As I say, as Jane said, it's really hard to predict sometimes what will and won't draw fire. But again, the most important thing is thinking about where you want to make your investment and what works best for what you are doing.